Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for a webinar on practical ecoacoustic methods for monitoring biodiversity. My colleague Andy White will introduce our invited guests.
Lin Schwarzkopf, Distinguished Professor Emeritus, College of Science and Engineering at JCU. So we've also got Dr. Sheryn Brodie and Dr. Sebastian Hoefer speaking today. So I will hand over to Lin to start the webinar.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present this webinar. And thanks to the ARDC. What we will be talking about today is building ecoacoustic monitoring programs. And we're going to focus on perhaps unusual parts of these kind of programs, unusual bits that people don't think about. I hope so, anyway. So I imagine everyone here knows that passive acoustic monitoring is where you just put automated sound recorders out in the bush and you capture the entire acoustic landscape of an ecosystem, just everything that happens. And so that includes the geophony, which is the wind and rain and earthquakes and lightning and things like that. Anthrophony, which includes planes, trains, and automobiles, people talking, things like that. And the biophony, which is all the animal noises, birds, frogs, mammals, insects, everything that makes noise. And of course, we know that biophony can be analyzed to measure biodiversity, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So what we're trying to achieve is something like this. We've got, I don't know, can people see Seb? Maybe I'll get rid of him. So what we're trying to achieve is this. We've got biological reality or something like biological reality out there in the world, and we want to make management decisions from the information we get from ecoacoustics. So that we should all agree on that. But there should be a lot of steps in between biological reality and making a management decision. And today, what I want to be talking about is these steps in here, or what we are all going to be talking about is that. I think what has happened in the ecoacoustics community is that there's been an intense focus on the orange step here, which is why I made this big circle orange. There's been an intense focus on recognizer or classifier building and the outputs from those and how good they are. And people have become really, really heavily focused on that. And I think that in order to build ecoacoustic monitoring, we need to think about these other steps a bit more. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And I think the reason why people have focused so heavily on recognizers is because there's a general perception that vocalization detection algorithms rely on vast amounts of training data. And so therefore, training a model is really hard and difficult to do and difficult to achieve. You can only do one at a time and it takes ages and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that now we've got a few new methods that allow us to approach this. And this isn't going to be a methods talk, but you may have heard about few-shot transfer learning or something like that. There's a paper on it here by Jacuzzi and Olden. If you're interested, that's where I got this sexy graphic. And so what we have is we have models now, which are kind of like large language models, but for birds. And they include BirdNet and Perch. And they include an awful lot of species of birds now. So you can actually just often search for a call within these or get a call and get that call identified right away. So we can already do that for a lot of things. It's not perfect, but it does work reasonably well. It especially works well in Europe and North America. There are species missing from these models. So there are species of birds that are not present, especially in Australia. But you can also use these models to detect novel signals. So you can get wind and rain, insects, amphibians, mammals, other stuff. And in my lab, we've been using large CNNs, these BirdNet and Perch, for detecting reptiles, mammals, including deer and other things, frogs, and insects. I've put whales here because other people have used them for whales. So the point is that you can put a sound into these models and quickly create a recognizer for a model that is for a sound that is not already in the model. And it works like this. You take your sample call and you only need one individual sample call. And it's usually not a bird anymore, although it could be a bird that isn't in there. Could be an insect, could be a mammal, could be an amphibian. You put it in there into the BirdNet algorithm or the Perch algorithm, and it breaks it. You've got a 3-second sample call. It breaks it up into a feature set of 1,024 numbers that describes the sound that you put in there. That's an example of a frog sound, if you heard it. I'm not sure if you could hear it. Then you take all the rest of your audio and you chop it up into 3-second segments. You put it through BirdNet or Perch, and it creates feature sets of 1,024 numbers or up to 1,024 numbers for all the rest of your sound samples. And then there's the frog again. And then you situate your sample call. So if you imagine all your audio looks like this, your sample call is here. Okay, so all your audio is described in a 1,024 dimensional space, and your call is here. And then calls that are close to it in that space tend to be that species or something like that species, which allows you to build a model that looks like this. The distances here are Euclidean distances. Okay, and so you can line up all the sounds that you get in your by distance, and you can, I guess I can leave that there. You can validate them, and you can see that sounds that are close in Euclidean distances, between 16 and 17 in this case, are, yes, they are your species, and there's ones that no are not your species, okay? And that allows you to create a threshold distance, and you can start thinking that everything less than that distance is your species. So you can build a recognizer very quickly using a logistic regression, GLM, and just do it fast. So we can do it fast. So you don't need to have millions of tons of data. You don't need to have millions of sample calls. In a way, it's a way of finding a lot of sample calls in your data and allowing you to build a recognizer quickly. So when we are doing monitoring now, what we need to think about is all these other steps, okay? So you may be monitoring a rare threatened species. You may be monitoring a rare invasive species. Now, this one's especially rare. No one's ever heard of the 7-legged gecko before. This is thanks to ChatGPT. But anyway, all invasive species are rare when they're first arriving, and so you may want to detect them when they're first arriving. And so you may want to detect an invasive species when it's rare. You may want to detect common invasive species because you're trying to control them, and you want to see if you're having any effect in their decline, or you want to know which times of year are they most active, all kinds of things like that. Or you want to maybe detect the whole vocalizing community. And I think we can do that now using the technique I just told you about. So I think one thing we should think about in Australia is monitoring common native species, because we can do that easily. Everyone who's got ecoacoustic recordings has got lots of examples of native species and their activity on there, and it would be worth thinking about noticing those species and seeing if they're declining. Excuse me. So once we know what we're doing, what we're trying to measure, we then have to decide, what do we need to know? And we need to decide whether we only want presence absence. Now, people have focused in general on the fact that presence absence is what we need or all we get from acoustic monitoring, but that's not really true anymore, because now we can record for long periods of time. We can get vocal activity, and vocal activity is often positively related to the numbers of animals. And so you may be able to get population size or an index of population size. You need to decide when you're going to record, because you want to record when they're most active if you're looking at activity as a gauge of how many there are. And you may want to measure overall biodiversity. So you need to make a decision about what you're measuring or which things of those you're measuring. Then you need to go out and you need to sample. I'm adding a comment here in that make sure you record metadata, especially where and when the recorders were placed, because many recorders don't do a very good job recording that they've been moved. So make sure you record where and when you put them there. But think hard about your sites, okay? Include controls. Don't only put recorders where you think you'll hear animals. Include places where you don't think you're going to hear them, just in case you do hear them. Or if you're creating an intervention, if you're controlling something, you want to know what's happening in the places you're not controlling them. Are you actually having an impact, or are they just declining because of seasonality or some other thing, less food around? So you need to think about where you're going to put your recorders with respect to what you're trying to achieve with management. Don't assume your animal only vocalizes at certain times. A lot of birds that are supposed to be diurnal vocalize at night. A lot of frogs that are supposed to be nocturnal vocalize during the day. You should really consider recording 24/7. And you should think about schedules. Schedules may not be necessary at all because we can store a lot more stuff than we used to be able to. But if you are going to sample, you may want to sample, for instance, 20 minutes an hour every second or third day, rather than just during the time that you think your animal is going to be active. There's a bunch of advantages to that. And I'm introducing Dr. Sebastian Hoefer, who you saw at the beginning. He's a postdoctoral fellow in my lab. He's working with the Department of Environment, Tourism, Science and Innovation in Queensland with Indigenous ranger groups to help develop monitoring programs that do what the rangers require. So he's helping them develop questions and designing sampling, and that's what he's going to be talking about today. Okay, recognize our outputs. Those are the orange ones that I told you were not that important anymore, or not deserving of laser focus is what I would say. So classifiers and recognizers are, of course, important. I'm not trying to say they're not. But we need to think now about balancing precision and recall, because for the most part, for biological recognition, we need to prioritize precision. So you need to think about how much precision and recall you need. For chorusing species that call a lot, you don't need precise recall. You don't need very high recall because you don't need every single call. You're going to hit a lot of the calls in a chorus, and so you don't need every single call. And for presence absence, which some of us are still trying to do, then you also don't need very high recall. You just need very precise, you need precision. Okay, so then we have our metrics that we're going to create. And so we use detections for occupancy estimates over here. So that's where we need high precision. That's presence absence at a site level. And now in my lab, we're working more with activity. So what's the relationship between activity and population size? So if you have surveys that tell you population size, you can compare them with activity, and you can see if there's a relationship between activity and population size that might give you an index of numbers of individuals. And we can also get community composition from species lists. Of course, that's easier with just hits or precision. And that's very powerful because you can record for a long time. And so you can get everybody in the community over the course of a year or a couple of years. And Sheryn's going to be talking to you today. She's a postdoctoral fellow in my lab as well. She's been working with NESP and also Parks Australia, building a monitoring program for the woodland birds on Christmas Island. And she'll talk to you about sampling and occupancy and activity and how we're using those to build a monitoring program. So the last thing we do, of course, once we've got our measures, is we can start making ecological inferences. We can figure out whether occupied sites are increasing or decreasing. Are there fewer occupied sites because that's bad? Are there more occupied sites? Maybe if you're looking at an invasive species, it's bad too. Is activity increasing or decreasing? And what does it mean? We have to know the difference between seasonal activity and not seasonal activity. And when, like yearly, is there differences in how much activity there is? Are numbers of individuals or our abundance proxy increasing or decreasing? These are important things to know. And are our interventions working? And maybe we can start looking, as I said, at the abundances of common species. These are not common species. I don't even know what they are. But anyway, we can look at the abundances of different species that we haven't been thinking about at all because we have this data now. And the idea is that we can use information to make better management decisions, which is what we all want, I think, or what a lot of us want. Excuse me. The key takeaways from my talk are: don't obsess about having loads and loads of training data. Good models can now be built fast for lots of things using only a few sample calls. Even just one works. And don't obsess about recall because it can be low for lots of the monitoring tasks that we need to do most of the time. But do think about what is it exactly that you want to know and how are you going to best place your recorders, record, do everything else to find that out. how best you're going to sample to answer your question, to really answer your question. What inferences can you safely make from your data? Can you actually infer something about activity? Can you infer something about numbers of individuals, things like that? And how will you use it to manage? How will you best use it to manage? I think we're moving on to Seb now.
Thanks, Lynn, for that. Thank you all for tuning in and coming to this. So as Lynn alluded to, monitoring is very different things to different people. And I wanted to start by giving more of a general overview of what considerations are important when designing an ecoacoustic monitoring program, and then dive a little bit deeper into an acoustic monitoring project we established in collaboration with First Nations ranger groups across Queensland. So I'll start with the more broad considerations. So the most important thing when you're trying to come up with the design is just figuring out what the goal is of the whole thing, because the survey design is entirely dependent on identifying a really clear survey or monitoring goal. So are you targeting single target species, or is the whole community, so biodiversity is what you're after? Are you looking at aquatic, terrestrial, or arboreal species, or all of them? Are you interested in species richness, vocal activity, occupancy, habitat use? Also, is it a long-term monitoring project, or is it more like a short-term bioblitz that maybe gets repeated every once in a while? Do you have any prior knowledge of the target's sounds that you're really interested in? For example, do you know anything about the activity patterns or vocal activity? What is it like during the day? What is it like over the whole year? Do you know anything about habitat preference or home range? Do your species or your target sounds, do they move around a lot, or are they more stationary at a particular location? Also, what kind of recording equipment do you have access to? Are you able to get sort of more long-term audio recorders, or is it more of the smaller, cheaper, short-term battery-powered audio recorders? Yeah. Similarly, what kind of microphones do you have access to? How many SD cards are you able to get, and what is the storage capacity of those? And yeah, again, with the audio recorders, are you able to get solar powered devices, or is it entirely dependent on battery? So all of these are sort of, some of those really important considerations to begin with to even start thinking about designing it. Because when you're survey, or when you're thinking about the survey design, the target sounds, they're crucial because they will determine all these other considerations for the survey design. How many recorders do you actually need is obviously often the starting point. And then where are they placed? So the spatial considerations, where are you putting them? How many do you have to get? How do you replicate the placement of those recorders? You got to think about the detection distance of each of those recorders and what might influence that detection distance because of the habitat, for example. Again, knowledge on the habitat use and the home range of those species. If they're stationary at a particular habitat structure, then maybe you need to only record there. And then there are temporal considerations. So how long can you actually deploy those audio recorders for, or do you want to? What's the recording schedule like? Are you going to do continuous, or are you going to duty cycle your recordings? What about the maintenance protocol? Are you going to be able to maintain those audio recorders regularly, and how often can you do that? And do you have any help doing that? The sampling rate is really important, obviously, to try to figure out what frequency you're going to be recording in. And then there are considerations on the data storage. How much data can you actually store, and do you have access to long-term data storage? How are you going to sort of wrangle or access that data, and how are you going to analyze the data? And to begin with, it could be really useful to start with a pilot study to understand your survey design, where you also maybe get some information about the species presence in your audio recordings, and you might get some information about noise pollution, maybe some anthrophony, where some human-made sounds that are really disturbing the recordings in the particular areas. You might have to actually move it, or you might get some information about the habitat features that might impact your detection distance. You're not really getting any recordings or any sounds from the place that you're actually interested in, because the habitat features are sort of impacting that. So for the spatial consideration, or for the recorder placement, there are a couple of really sort of common ways of sampling. There's sort of your systematic sampling, where you're sampling at sort of fixed intervals across the whole area. It's probably the easiest design because it's, those fixed distances, the space between them, so it can be easier to navigate that in the field and deploy them. But you may require more samples and they may be less representative. As you can see in that little graphic there, that yellow habitat doesn't actually get sampled because of those fixed distances. So you might miss out on some habitat. And then there's stratified random sampling. So that's when you are selecting the groups. So in this case, those 4 different habitat types, and then you randomly sample within them. That sort of ensures representation of all of those relevant groups, but it requires prior knowledge, and you may not represent the groups very well because if it's random, you might cluster some of those points. And as you can see there, some of those points are overlapping. And then there's stratified systematic sampling. So again, you're kind of designating particular groups beforehand, and you're putting a number of fixed samples within them, and you are representing the groups and with a more even coverage that way. But again, it requires prior knowledge, and maybe even coverage is not possible depending on what kind of landscape it is and what those habitat features look like. And then there's purposive sampling. So that's where you're sort of selecting the sampling based on assumptions. So you are really highly efficient for a specific purpose. So let's say you wanted to sample creek lines. So you're just selecting the creek lines and you're sampling right along them, which obviously requires certain assumptions and prior knowledge. And it introduces a bias because you're only sampling that particular habitat type or that particular group. And then for the temporal considerations, particularly schedules, for the deployment length, that is really important to figure out because it will determine the type of recorder, because some recorders are going to be able to be deployed for longer periods of times, and some of them will be more short term. So figuring out how long you can leave those audio recorders out there, whether that's many years or just a couple of weeks at a time, is really important to figure out what you can actually get. As I said, maintenance protocols, is it actually regularly accessible? Are you going to be able to go there and switch out batteries and SD cards and check on them for damages and whether they're still functional? If you can't, then maybe a more long-term option with the solar panel may be more suited in that case. Recording schedules, whether you're doing continuous or duty cycles. And again, a pilot study could be super useful to understand that sort of temporal considerations as well. Identifying potentially seasonal calling windows, looking at DL patterns of activity, and then sort of weather-dependent activity. More specifically for the temporal or for the recording schedules, the continuous recordings, obviously you're recording all the time, and therefore you have a higher chance to detect cryptic or rare species. And you're getting a high resolution data for seasonal and DL activity patterns, which you can then potentially link to environmental variables to get answer some interesting questions. But obviously it produces a large amount of data, and there are higher costs for those recorders and for the maintenance because you have to swap that out all the time, those SD cards, for example. Now, duty cycle is where you record a certain number of minutes per day and then a certain number of days per year. And that way, you're lowering your chance of detecting cryptic or rare species, and you're potentially getting a low resolution data for those environmental links, but you're producing more manageable amounts of data, and you might have a lower cost for recorders and maintenance, and also a longer battery life, which enables also cheaper recorders. Now, for the duty cycled aspect, the best way you can do this is obviously as long as possible, but more importantly, as frequently as possible. So doing half the time, if you're recording 1 minute on, 1 minute off, is better than 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off. And you can see this little figure here from Wu et al. In 2024, where they looked at the mean difference in vocal activity rate between continuous recordings and the duty cycled recordings. So on the y-axis here, you see if it's at 0, it means that there's basically no difference between duty cycled and continuous. And if it's up all the way to 12 here, it means that the duty cycle, there's a huge difference. And on the x-axis, the coverage. So half the time, a third of the time, a sixth of the time, and so on. And within those brackets is sort of the frequency. So 1 minute on, 1 minute off, 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, that sort of thing. And you can see that even if you're only sampling a sixth of the time, if you're doing more frequently, so 1 minute on, 5 minutes off, you're actually getting a better result than if you're recording half of the time, but 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off. So more frequently is really important, but ideally, obviously, also as long as possible. Now, for the sampling rates, it's kind of obvious, but we want to make sure that we're getting the frequency of the things that we're interested in. And a really important thing to consider here is that sort of Nyquist-Shannon theorem. So that sort of determines that the sampling rate must be at least twice as high as the highest frequency of interest. And that's because you need 2 sampling points per cycle to catch that crests and the trough to accurately represent each of the sound waves. And that means if you're interested in, let's say, a bird at 3 kilohertz, you want to make sure that you're recording at least 6 kilohertz to capture that bird. Now, for the sampling rates, if you're recording at around 22 kilohertz, which is that green box here, you will be getting, most of the birds, amphibians, reptiles, most mammals, most invertebrates, and a few bats. If you then up it to 44 kilohertz, you're getting additional bats and you're getting additional invertebrates. And then above 44 kilohertz, you're in that ultrasonic frequency range. And that's where you're getting a lot of those really high-pitched vocalizing bats that you can't hear. But obviously, the higher your sampling rate is, the more data storage is required. So that's an important thing to consider. Okay, so that's sort of the more general considerations or important considerations when you're trying to come up with a ecoacoustic monitoring project. And I wanted to sort of dive into what we've been working on, which is that Listening to Country project, which is a collaborative partnership designed to empower Indigenous ranger groups by sort of bridging the gap between acoustic data collection and the actionable ecological management outcomes. And what we're trying to do is we're building capacity for acoustic monitoring. So sort of enabling the rangers or teaching the rangers how to use acoustic devices and think about what needs to be in place for this to happen and add this as a tool to their toolkit in order to look after and care for country. And it's all based within that right way science approach, which, if you haven't heard of it, is defined as a collaborative process of bringing Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge and methods together to create an ethical, productive, and mutually beneficial research. And as the Matu people put it, it's an exchange of knowledge and a chance to learn based on mutual respect, responsibility, and connectedness. It's a collaboration that recognizes the value each group brings to a project when there's a shared interest in the outcomes. And we want to make sure that we work in close partnerships with each of those groups and co-design and execute monitoring projects that meet the specific objectives of those groups. And the foundation is really a commitment to a transparent and adaptive and deeply collaborative process to ensure that the rangers' needs are met and they prioritize sort of every step. That prioritizes every step of the way. And at the moment, we've got these 4 groups here, the Junjawara, Normanby, Yorman, and Tagalaka, that we're working with really closely, as well as we're in conversations with a bunch of other groups and hopefully have many more in the future. There are a bunch of different things a bunch of different objectives that the groups are interested in. There's an interest in threatened species detection, particularly Gouldian finches and golden-shouldered parrots are really, really important and of interest to the groups. Feral animal control and management, and particularly what the impact of that is once you start controlling those feral species. The impact of preservation and sort of restoration of water bodies on biodiversity. They've been really badly impacted by ungulates. And so, once you actually protect those water bodies, what does that mean for biodiversity? Gathering evidence for the success of cultural burning practices, as well as assessing biodiversity in areas that are really difficult to access regularly, like on top of mountains and really far, hard to access places. And then as a public engagement tool as well, to get sort of the younger generation interested, going back out onto country and getting involved. So you can take those sound clips and potentially go into classrooms and then show them what healthy country sounds like, to get them wanting to come out and help. Now, so far, we've had the chance to deliver sort of hands-on training to the ranger groups on sort of the principles on acoustic monitoring and recorder deployment, equipment maintenance, and the data management workflows, all in order to establish an ongoing acoustic monitoring projects where the ranger groups are able to do everything from start to finish by themselves. it's really important that we make sure that the sort of data transfer analysis is really transparent and can really easily be followed by the groups. And we're utilizing EcoSounds, that Open Acoustics platform, to sort of store the audio data, have it accessible, and then analyze it as well. And ultimately, the goal is to build a useful tool to visualize the audio data really simply, so that the groups can really see potentially when their target species are active and where they're active. So get information about sort of space and time when things are around. And again, this is all based on the Right Way Science approach. So it's really important that we're very transparent. There's a lot of communication and collaboration going on, and a knowledge exchange. It's really important to build these relationships based on trust and mutual respect. And ultimately, the ranger groups are conceptualizing the research ideas, and they're there to collect data. And they're currently possessing the skills to successfully deploy and maintain audio recorders. But sort of the specialized partners required to help realize the full potential of the data. And that's where we come in, where we support with the data management and the analysis process. And then ultimately, we want to report those scientific findings together and make sure that the research as well as management outcomes are met. Now, if we're running through the conceptualization using one of those objectives I mentioned, it kind of could look like this. So you think about the goal. The goal in this case is to figure out if biodiversity is potentially increasing at those water bodies after you're controlling and excluding ungulates from water bodies. And so in this case, you might be interested in a whole community target with various life histories and potentially looking at species richness and vocal activity to begin with. Now, for that, you probably want to get a sort of long-term audio recorder option. So something with a sonar panel that can sit out there and record audio data continuously, particularly in regions where you might not be able to access it, maybe due to weather, like the wet season, where you might have to have these devices out there for months on end and no one is able to check on them and make sure that they're still functioning and recording then. So yeah, continuous recordings in this case we're interested in. We want to make sure that there's some regular maintenance schedule set up where groups are able to go out there and do checks on the recorders and the SD cards. And in this case, we're using purposive sampling because we are interested in water bodies, particular water bodies. We want to make sure that we have multiple copies and that long-term data storage is given. So we create, local copies as well as, in our case, using EcoSounds for cloud storage. And then we're analyzing the audio data by machine learning and have extensive expert validation to make sure that those detections are actually true detections. And then, potentially develop call recognizers for particular species to make sure that future audio data that we're getting is going to be more effectively and quickly analyzed.
Thanks, Seb. So, I'm going to be conscious of time, so I might give a very overview at the start. But I'm Sheryn at JCU in Townsville. And in my postdoctoral research, we've been working with Parks Australia and Christmas Island National Park to explore what role acoustic monitoring might have for the species conservation and management, using Christmas Island National Park as a test case for national parks generally. This is a NEST project supported by the Australian government. And I'll give you a brief overview, background of the project and the steps we've taken to build the monitoring program and some opportunities and challenges we've faced along the way. So if you don't know Christmas Island, it's Australian island territory in the Indian Ocean, about 350 kilometres south of Java. It is renowned for its high species endemism and, of course, its famous red crabs and the red crab migration. And Christmas Island National Park covers about 63% of the island managed by Parks Australia. And it's a good test case for establishing an acoustic monitoring program because it's an isolated island. There are relatively few species there. There are about 22 resident breeding species of bird and one species of mammal, the Christmas Island flying fox. So building this program, I'll just introduce our target species. So we have six forest bird species that we're targeting initially in this acoustic monitoring program, and the flying fox. And I guess it's just important to point out why we've chosen these species. So they're all endemic to Christmas Island, either at the species or subspecies level. So they're being in an island habitat, they're species of concern being endemic. And 4 of the bird species are currently vulnerable or threatened. The Christmas Island flying fox is classified as critically endangered. And so you'll meet these birds a bit more later on. And so I came up with my own hierarchy of what are the questions what do we want to know in our acoustic monitoring program, and starting from a broader overall question of what we really want to know is in monitoring, are these species populations stable, or are they increasing, or are they declining? But to get there, we need to, using acoustic monitoring data, we need to know what are we going to measure. Can we get metrics like site occurrence, presence or absence out of the acoustic data, and vocal activity, so using detection rate. But then we have further, more detailed questions from there. Okay, if we can measure, we have some questions about how reliable is this method going to be? Can we reliably detect these species using acoustic data? When should we record? How many sites should we record? And is vocal activity related to, is it a good reflection of abundance? And so just an overview of our actual recording regime. We recorded at about 80 sites, give or take, depending on the project's been going for over 2 years now. So sometimes, recorders are in and out of commission. We commenced back in May 2023 after a pilot program. The number of sites generally became restricted by the number of recorders that were available and working. We started with a few more in the pilot site, but that was whittled down. We used bar LT recorders from Frontier Labs down in the left-hand bottom picture. There we put a mesh over the microphone because we had problems with something, we're not sure, chewing the microphone foam. And we also had at the start 5 solar bars, so that's a solar powered bar there, which we actually found worked well only if it was out in an open habitat. They weren't reliable in forests because the power was quite intermittent. Initially we started recording 24/7, but we found that after a couple of months that the project just didn't have the resources to be able to go out and service and change the batteries regularly enough. Running the bar LTs on battery power, they ran out of power after about a month of continuous 24-hour recording. So we changed that schedule down to 20 minutes per hour on the hour all day, so that we could then get 3 months recording out of each recorder. And we wanted to, because we're recording multiple species and the hawk owl being a nocturnal species, we wanted to record across the whole day. And then later in the project, again, because of resourcing logistics, we changed that to every second day just because of being able to get out to the island, go around to all the sites and change batteries. So we still had that temporal coverage over the year. And the map there just shows you generally the sites, recording sites that we used across the island. So we wanted an island-wide coverage. And just to mention that what we do with our audio when we collect it off SD cards, it's uploaded to the EcoSounds repository, which was created and is run by QUT Ecoacoustics Research, Paul Rose Lab, and Anthony Truskinger. And we upload it from JCU using a nice fast internet connection, which is necessary. It's not much luck if you don't have one. And the EcoSounds repository is brilliant. It's good at safe storage. It organises, Anthony's written it so that it organises your audio file metadata for you. It does have playback and annotation download functions. We don't use that in this project because it's a big project. And now it also has into it analysis functions. So with the perch or BirdNet classifiers, it will generate your embeddings for you, and it will soon be generating your classifier detections for you. So just a note on that. And so the question, reliable automated call detection, can we do it? Yes, we can. And so I'm going to sort of skim over this because Lin did touch on the state of classifiers where we're at the moment, but all this great intense work was done by Phil Ochinsky at QUT at the start of the project to build our classifiers, and we used the Perch CNN model, which is developed by Google Research. And yeah, as Lin talked about, it uses that few-shot transfer learning. So we only needed to start with sometimes one training example of each species. So we did collect some voucher calls. So an actual, when you go out and identify a bird and say, yes, I'm recording, the emerald dove, this is it. And that's our example training call. Or for the goshawk, we had to go to Xenocanto. We didn't get any voucher calls on the island, but the goshawk is sometimes considered a subspecies of the brown goshawk. So we used an example call of Xenocanto for that. And that starts the process that's building the classifiers, improving them through iterations. So you can use those initial training examples to find more training examples in your actual field data to build really good classifiers. And just some technical notes before I go on, it will help with my next slide. The way the Perch classifier model works is it segments the audio into 5-second segments, analyzes that, and for each species model, it gives each segment, 5-second segment, a prediction score as to how confident it is that that 5-second segment has your target species. And then what we do with that. So Lin also touched on this before. We have all these detections, I think at last count, we have over 380,000 hours of audio. And so if you try to work out, how many 5-second segments that is, it's millions and millions. And so obviously not all of those segments are going to contain your target species, but they're all analysed and they all get a score by the Perch model. So you want to count detections. How many of these audio segments have your actual species in them, calling in them? And so we use this logistic regression approach to determine a score threshold. So we want to basically only, we want to chuck out all the segments that aren't our species and count how many detections of our species we've got. So you validate a sample of audio segments across a range of scores, do a logistic regression, that gives you curves like this. And the one on the left is the classifier for the thrush. And ideally you want it to look like this. So when you have the data dots down the bottom are negative examples, so segments that don't have the species, you want that nice curve where it's can ideally almost get separation between your negative and positive examples. And the hawk owl there shows an example of where we can get a score threshold that gives us high confidence of true positive calls, but we're still missing a lot of calls. So talking about what I did with these detection calls, firstly, I took an occupancy modelling approach, and an assumption of occupancy models is that there are no false positives. So I had to choose a score threshold that gave me a very high confidence that I only had true detections in there. And so that's often, the first question that you can address with this type of data. I've applied the score threshold, only looked at call detections above the threshold, and it can give us a nice picture of where we're detecting our species. So where do our species occur? What sites do they use? And the nice thing with acoustic data is if you have long-term acoustic data, it's a very rich source of data. You can aggregate it in different ways. So you can choose different periods. You can aggregate, months and days. This is just over our first year of monitoring, the sites that we detected the species at. And you can see that even just a couple of examples that these birds are quite widespread across the island. The emerald dove wasn't detected at some sites, but the pigeon and a few of the other species are detected just about everywhere across the island. One other question we wanted to address was, how does this acoustic detection method compare with traditional field surveys? And I did this using the occupancy modelling. So this is the detection probability estimates using occupancy models that I did in R. And I compared it with point count surveys that we did at our site. So we did these surveys at our recorder sites over 2 years, except for the hawk owl, which was a nocturnal survey done in the second year. And I calculated the occupancy and detection probability in that same period. And the takeaway to this is that except for the hawk owl, we actually get better or as good as detection probability using acoustic modelling, acoustic monitoring data. And with acoustic data, we get better estimates, so lower, smaller confidence intervals, which is better for occupancy modelling. We want good estimates. And then, so stepping on from this, what we did, if you'll sort of notice back here, that the detection probabilities vary. So detection of the dove and the goshawk are quite low, but the other species are quite high. So we wanted to focus on what were the times of year that we could better detect the emerald dove and the goshawk, because their detection probability is generally low, whereas the other species are quite high most of the year. So to be able to, maximise the monitoring capability. So this is a temporal plot of the monthly detection probability just from the acoustic data to show us that, there are better times of year than in July and when we did the surveys, when the doves were hardly calling, because they're very seasonal, to give us an idea of when to record. And so from that, what I did was I did a power analysis. So I used an approach where we can use an approximation equation to calculate the statistical power. And the aim here is to detect a decline in occupancy from one monitoring period to another. So say from this year to next year. What's the power and what's the effect size that we can detect? And this was to inform, how many sites do we need to record at, how many days do we need to record for, and is it feasible? And this is the example for the emerald dove, which with its low probability of detection was the most challenging one. I found in all the cases that the advantage of acoustic monitoring is because we can record for extended periods of time. You get better power than just doing a few surveys, but beyond 30 days, you don't get much extra advantage out of it. But it's quite straightforward. If you're going to put recorders out for a week, there's no sort of extra effort just to leave them out for another few weeks. But what this is really showing here is that there's some decisions to be made. Depending on how many, what's feasible as far as the number of sites that you're able to monitor, and what's a meaningful effect size, so occupancy decline that you're wanting to detect. So say, for example, if you had 100 recorders and you had the capability to record at 100 sites for a month, you could detect, let's just say a bit more than a 0.25 decline in occupancy with 80% power. So it gives a real sort of guideline to Parks Australia for what kind of effort they need and what size decline are we able to detect even for this dove that's difficult to detect sometimes. And so, moving on. So moving on from occupancy analysis, looking at using that vocal activity. So rather than just reducing the data to presence-absence, actually looking at calculating the detection rate. So number of detections, this is a plot example of a number of detections each day, standardised for the number of hours recording, so recording effort. And this is a nice example of the seasonality in the emerald dove and the low detection rate. The grey box there shows a period where we missed data because a lot of the recorders ran out of power, so we didn't have enough recorders going there. So that's just to show a use there of how you get really nice temporal activity patterns. And moving on from that, what we also wanted to know was, does vocal activity reflect survey counts? So again, we used the survey data that we did in those two years, four survey visits at each site doing point counts, to see if our detection rate was a good, I guess if it related to the survey counts. And what we found was there, reasonably good correlations between, we've got acoustic detection rate and the average survey count in each year. So each of these points is one site in 1 year. And I guess it's important to point out there that even though, the correlations aren't perfect, that point count surveys, the counts from those surveys, they're, not a true reflection of abundance either. So they're an index of abundance as well. So here we can see that the acoustic detection rate as an index correlates well with survey counts as an index. And I think I've got the other examples in there as well, just showing that we can correlate the detection rate. And so it gives us a good foundation that we can use vocal activity as a metric for monitoring, to be able to monitor if there's changes going on. How do we go? Okay, and so from here, what we're doing, we're still exploring the vocal activity metrics. I want to get into seeing if we can reduce the false negatives. So using more of the data at the moment, using that, really blunt threshold, assures us we have positives, but it also throws out a lot of that, false negatives, I guess we call them. So detections that we're missing because we're using that high threshold. And so there are ways that we can, use detection probability to use more of that data. And then looking at power analysis again to be able to detect changes in that vocal activity is where we want to go with that. And I just want to acknowledge just some acknowledgements there of who's been involved, lots of people involved in this project. And that's me. I think that's my last slide. So I'm hoping we've got time for questions now.
Oops, we all talked for too long.
But yeah.
Oh, you can go on for another hour, in my opinion, but I guess I'm not the boss of it.
There's only a couple of questions that haven't been asked, but if anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask away.
Can I also just say that we can last beyond the hour? So if people want to stay online, I understand people are busy, but if people want to stay online and are desperate for an answer, or you can just email us and we'll be happy to answer you.
Yeah, brilliant. So if you need to run now, please give us a question and take off. But yeah, I'm very happy to host people on for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes to follow up on these. Well, I'm going to start with one of the last questions, which was about the standardizing effort between point counts and acoustic monitoring to do the occupancy modeling and compare them. Sheryn, I think you started getting towards that and you explored that in your later slides. So is there anything you could say about the standardizing the effort between those two?
So I guess when you say standardized, so we wanted to compare the two methods, so the effectiveness of the two methods. So the surveys were done within a 5 or 6 week period. So we actually had a birder go out and do surveys at all the sites 4 times, which is the general approach in occupancy modelling. You do repeat surveys. So I just looked at the detections in that same period. So in the 5 to 6 week survey period. So I got daily detections, daily presence absence out of the acoustic detections in that same period. So we wanted to do a comparison as, what's the results if you were to use repeat surveys for occupancy modelling, or if you were to use acoustic recording for occupancy modelling, what's the outcomes of using either of those approaches? So, so I guess, they are different methods. So I don't know if standardizing is the right word, but it's comparing the methods. Does that help?
My assessment of your answer is correct, is that's great. Another question, I'm going to move over to one from Clara. For a project tracking site level changes in the population, for a project tracking site level changes in population composition across seasons, would it be sufficient to leave the recorders out for a week at a time at each site for each season, or would they be better staying out for longer?
I can probably take that unless you want to answer it, Seb. It depends on your animal or whatever you're trying to follow. Okay, so a week at a time might be good if it's a Christmas Island thrush and it never shuts up. But if it has a seasonal time that it calls or something like that, then you need to have your recorders out at the right time. Sometimes what you need to do is record for a while to be able to figure out what the right time period is. So when is that animal most active? And then that way you can detect its activity each season, and you know when to record to do that if you can only do it. So we've been recommending more and more to people record 24/7 or do what Seb suggested and record in chunks of time, but record for long periods so that you at least initially get an idea when your animals are active. Does that answer your question, Clara?
And yes, we got a yep in the chat.
Oh, great. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Lynn. Andrew had an answer for Sheryn about talking about the Christmas Island pipistrelle insectivorous bat.
Yeah.
Andrew, would you like to speak to that comment that you put in the chat?
Yeah, it's just something that's talking about Christmas Island. I thought, there was this little bat that went extinct a long time ago. Well, not a long time ago, 2009.
Yeah, recently, yeah.
Recently. And look, it won't be the first species that's been presumed extinct and then excitedly being rediscovered sometime down the track. Brodie wallaby is a classic example of that. But yeah, I just thought if you're out there sticking monitors around Christmas Island, and I know you'd probably have to change the frequency settings on your devices. Would it be also worth running a recognizer for that if you could create one? There's got to be spectrographs because they were monitoring for those bats using antibats. I just thought you might get.
Yeah, there's lots of considerations. Yeah, because bat monitoring in ultrasound is has a different kind of approach. And I know they did back at the time it went extinct. There was some intensive monitoring going on. Now that's generally how they would monitor for microbats, is using the specialized ultrasound recorders. And I do know that the topic comes up every now and then about whether it should just be tried again to see if they can be detected. But I do know at the time it was when the working group was raising the alarm bells, they were intensively monitoring, and they basically watched it go extinct pretty much in the monitoring data. They could see it going, yeah. But yeah, it's not, you're not the only one who brings that up. It is an ongoing discussion, but it's kind of recording in ultrasound uses more power and more data storage. It's got to specialize, so it's possible, but we have to factor in, that the file size is going to get so much bigger, but it's and building a recognizer, definitely feasible.
Yeah, and actually following on from that, I'll read out another question or set of questions from a reflection from Clayton, who says logistics, power, data storage, access and labour for maintenance has been repeatedly flagged as a challenge. Is this a real limitation impacting research or management, or is it just a frustration that needs to be accepted and contingencies put in place? So Lynn started off answering, they're not a frustration, you just need to optimise them so you get the answers you're actually after. But Lynn and others, would you like to expand on answers to this question?
I'm happy to, Seb. Yeah, unless you want to. Yeah, I guess it is a real limitation. It's how many recorders you have. It's how much money you have to drive, hire cars and drive around and put the recorders out. Some analysis shows that if you had 300 sites, you could really, detect and monitor really well. But it's got to be it's within limitations of what's feasible. That's just a practical consideration, and some people might be frustrated by that, I don't know, or some people might just accept it.
And often that's where pilot studies come in, right? Like you give it a try, you record for a certain amount of time, maybe with a certain number of recorders, and then you realize, oh, I actually need more, or maybe I don't actually need that many. Maybe I can cut down, like just going out there. And then, as Lin mentioned, starting off with continuously recording is probably your best bet, just so that you can kind of understand when things are at time after that. Once you really understand when things are active, you don't want to start off potentially missing stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
I can answer that one. It says, sorry if this is off topic for the webinar, but I was wondering if you can speak to how well developed the Acoustic Observatory of Australia is. Would it be feasible to use the existing recordings on there to do occupancy modeling in well-developed survey areas instead of conducting new acoustic surveys? Yes, it would be brilliant if somebody used the Acoustic Observatory to do that. So we have 4 recorders at each site in the observatory, and it has 2 that are close to water and 2 that are further away. These may not be perfectly useful for you. They may not be in the right place for whatever it is you want to look at, but it's certainly feasible to check out the locations. My postdoc has just published a paper. A different postdoc, Slade Alan Anderson, has published a paper looking for every threatened species that we could find, threatened, vulnerable, all those sorts of things that we could find on the Acoustic Observatory. So if you're specifically interested in a threatened species, you could look at that paper and see whether that species is in there and whether he found it. If he didn't find it, you could talk to him about how hard he looked, because he looked reasonably hard, but he had 73 species to look for, so he didn't look all that hard. So hopefully that is helpful. But yes, you can absolutely access all the data there, and you could look through it, and we can help you look through it and facilitate your use of the A2O. Absolutely. Does that answer questions?
Awesome.
Might help you with that, what do you call it? Pilot study, for example.
Yeah.
Somebody called Tom has his hand up.
Yeah, go for it, Tom. You'll need to unmute.
Muted.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just trying to figure out how to unmute that. I have 2 questions. Just looking at some of the data that you guys were presenting, and with the vocalizations, it was kind of making me think of like how do you deal with the same species, say a bird making different types of calls, so a territorial call versus some sort of mating attracting call, and that goes for different species too, but yeah, primarily interested in that. And second, this is a little bit more of a, I don't know if this has ever happened yet, but it's sort of maybe an interesting hypothetical, but what do you think would happen if something like a lyrebird came along and made a bunch of different vocalizations in front of one of these devices, listening devices? Would you be able to tell if it's a lyrebird versus the real thing?
I can answer those questions. First of all, we don't know anything about birds. We work on frogs and mammals, and most of them only have one call. No, that's true, but it's also not really correct. So what we tend to use for a lot of the birds is things like contact calls that they make all the time, and that are useful. But you can actually build a recognizer with several different calls, and it doesn't matter. It learns to recognize them just the way a person does, in a way. And so it's fine. You can use all the calls of a bird and find it. It's nice to keep them separate, though, because you might want to use, for example, territorial sounds at some seasons, and you might want to use calls at other seasons, that kind of thing. But we do not specialize on that in our lab. In our lab, we're focused on identifying, finding things, and looking at levels of activity. So we haven't done that. As far as the lyrebird goes, it's my understanding that people can tell the difference between a lyrebird mimic of a call and an actual call by that bird. Is that true? I've seen someone do that, so I'm thinking that that's true.
I just wanted to say also that I just shared the link in here because that's a question that we quite often get with the lyrebirds. There's a paper on the vocal mimicry of lyrebirds, and if you look at the spectrograms in there, there's a slight difference between the vocalization of a lyrebird and the animal that it's trying to copy. Whether that's a kookaburra or something. So the thing is more about how much data do you have. If you have enough training data, then you can distinguish those two for sure. At the start, you might not be, and it might actually pull out the same species, but then it just depends on how much data you have. But if you have enough training data, if you have enough of the lyrebird vocalization copying the kookaburra and the actual kookaburra, you should be able to tell them apart, because there is, if you look at those spectrograms in that paper, for example, there is a difference in the vocalizations. But it's not easy.
And when we say enough training data, it means you need to have examples of the lyrebird copy, and you need to have examples of the not lyrebird copy, and you need to be able to chuck them into your data and find both of them and look at the difference. So yes, you should quickly be able to build recognizers that tell the difference, but it'll be harder than building a recognizer for two different species.
Wow, great. Well, those were awesome questions, Tom. And I feel like now's probably a good time to probably wrap up. I would love to go into this another time. So please, if you are keen to revisit this conversation or extend it on in any particular direction, please get in touch with Lin, Sheryn, Sebastian, myself, Andy. I'm not an ecologist, sorry. I just butt in and like talking about this stuff because my kid's a birder now, and so I'm so excited. Thank you for being part of this.
Would like to thank all of our presenters today for your time and diligence and sharing your expertise. And we just would like to thank the audience and the great questions you've given today. And we hope that we get to see you in one of these series in the future. So thank you very much, everyone.